Morning, everybody. So I think we're going to make a start now. I'm Andrew Geddes. I'm based here at the MPC, Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute, and we're starting our academic calendar a little early this year because we jumped at the opportunity of welcoming Professor Daniel Ghezelbash from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where he's a director of the Kaldor Centre and a professor of law at the University of New South Wales. We're very happy to welcome people in the room. We have people online as well. People online are very welcome to participate and join in the discussion, but ideally would put their questions into the chat box. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to interact after Daniel's presentation, which is on countering misinformation about refugees and migrants and evidence-based framework. Daniel will speak for around 30 minutes. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So very happy to welcome Daniel.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for hosting me. And thank you all for attending today. I'm delighted to be able to present our new report on countering misinformation about refugees and migrants that we prepared and released in collaboration with the Behavioural Insights team. The purpose of the report is to tap into the latest behavioral science to explain both how misinformation works and, importantly, how that information can empower us all to stop its spread. So I'm going to begin with some initial framing about why we embarked on this project, and then try and walk you through some of the behavioral science of misinformation, noting that I'm a lawyer and not a behavioral scientist, but I'll do my best to unpack it all for us today. And then run through a practical step-by-step framework for counteracting misinformation, and then as well as covering at the end some tips for engagement in terms of actually how we get the messages out there, which is a concluding part of the report. So if you're here today, I'm assuming you already share our concerns about the threat that misinformation poses to our society and democracy. I really think it's one of the biggest threats that's facing our society today. It's undermining our social cohesion and leading to a fragmented society. For us to be able to come together and collectively work on shared problems, we need to have a shared vision, and misinformation undermines this. If we can't agree on the facts, we can't have a meaningful public discussion or develop shared goals, and we can't address the real issues that we face. And instead, we get bad policies and a weakened democracy. Refugee and migration issues are unfortunately an area where misinformation is particularly pervasive, particularly in the lead up to elections. While this puts us all at risk, the worst consequences fall on refugees and migrants themselves, including discrimination, social exclusion, and harmful policies. And we're increasingly seeing misinformation targeting migrant communities themselves in a bid to sow division for political gain. Sorry, I skipped my first slide, but moving to the third one. So just a little bit of background about the Kaldor Centre. So a core part of our mission is to draw on cutting-edge research to inform policymaking and public policy debates on refugee law and forced migration. And aside from the broader concerns that I outlined now about the impact of misinformation, it was also causing, I guess, a threat to our ability to deliver on our mission, because if we're producing evidence-based interventions in an environment where we're being drowned out by misinformation, we're not going to be able to cut through and deliver on our mission. So to meet this challenge, we initiated a collaboration with the Behavioural Insights team. So they're a social purpose consulting firm that started out as the so-called nudge unit in the UK government, which basically their brief is to apply behavioural science to public policy issues. And the result of our work with BIT is this report that helps us understand how misinformation works and what we can do about it. And bad faith actors, as you all know, are getting very savvy in terms of producing and disseminating misinformation, but also coordinating around the dissemination of misinformation. And I think one of our hopes with this report is to help those that want to push back to get equally savvy in how we engage. And while our focus is on refugee and migration issues, the framework that we set out in the report actually stands alone. It could be applied to any area of public policy. Before I jump in, maybe a few caveats about what the report does do and doesn't do. So it's really a practical framework to help you decide what to do when you counter misinformation. So do you engage? And if so, how do you engage? And I'm sure many of you grapple with this already. It comes up all the time in the work of our centre where we see something outrageous come up on social media. And this was really one of the motivations for undertaking this, because there was a few instances where, like, do I engage? Or we get a call from a journalist wanting to comment on some outrageous claim some fringe actor has made. And our approach had been, don't run the story. I mean, this is a non-story. By running the story, you make it a story. But we thought we needed a kind of an evidence base in terms of how, what the latest behavioral science says, and how we react in those circumstances. But it's not a playbook that prescribes every word, specific wording on how to respond to misinformation. And it's not a messaging guide or a campaign strategy or copy and paste collateral. What it is sort of offers a structured framework for deciding how and when to respond, underpinned by key behavioral science principles. So in order to effectively counteract misinformation, it's important to understand how and why it's spreading. And understanding these dynamics was so central to this project, and also fed into designing the framework that I'll outline in a moment. And so there's two big factors here, and really our report, our intervention deals with the second one, which is the human psychology of it. But it's also important to acknowledge the role that the media environments are playing in facilitating and spreading misinformation. So I'm sure you all know that online platforms are creating the perfect breeding ground for spreading misinformation. Information travels instantly across the world. Very little of it is fact-checked or subject to basic media standards for accuracy. And people are sharing content between social and family groups that can easily become echo chambers that polarize attitudes. More recently, we're also seeing the rise of AI generated misinformation, both in terms of creating large amounts of false content, but also increasingly deepfake images and videos that can further perpetuates the problem. The second factor, and what is really the focus of this report, is around the impact of human psychology on misinformation. The way we process information makes us particularly vulnerable to online misinformation, or to put it in the reverse, misinformation is often created to deliberately prey on our psychological biases. So we reviewed the literature and distilled 6 key behavioral science principles that are central to the spread of misinformation. The first is hot states. So misinformation is often created to trigger a visceral emotional response, such as fear or outrage. And I think, case in point here is Donald Trump's infamous claims that the immigrants are eating the cats. Emotional states disable our critical thinking skills. We become reactive and impulsively accept misinformation without verifying it, and we sometimes even share news stories without even reading them. The second principle is the messenger effect. So we tend to judge the truth of a message by who is communicating it. People trust what their friends or families tell them, even when that contradicts widely accepted expert consensus. The next principle is the mirror exposure effect. And this is simply that says, the principle that the more times we see something, the more likely we are to believe it, regardless of whether it's true. And then confirmation bias means that people tend to accept and believe information that conforms with their pre-existing views, and often reject offhand anything that contradicts that. And this is particularly causes particular issues in an area such as refugee or migration issues, where people tend to already hold deeply held beliefs on the issue. The next principle is the cognitive load. And so people struggle in online environments where we have an almost limitless amount of information being bombarded at us. When we're overloaded with choice and information, we tend to take mental shortcuts. And social media, where we're scrolling through endless information, tends to create the perfect breeding ground for the spread of misinformation. The final principle is the continued influence effect. So this means that even after a piece of misinformation is debunked, it tends to leave a lasting impact on people's emotions, judgment, and decision-making. And this has been studied in the context of political misinformation, where political actors make false claims that are then demonstrated to be false, and people understand that those claims were false and change their beliefs, but it's been shown to have a lasting impact on their support and voting intentions. So these 6 key principles explain how misinformation leads to false beliefs and poor decision-making, but they're also the foundation that we drew on, along with an extensive review of the latest literature on misinformation, to design the practical framework that I will run through now. So it can be a very crowded attention economy out there. As we've discussed, we have sophisticated bad faith actors that are flooding the internet with misinformation. Trying to respond to every piece of misinformation is impossible, but it can also be counterproductive. And I'll talk about why that is the case more in a moment. So, to respond to this, we developed what we hope is a very easy to follow framework for deciding when to ignore misinformation, when to take action, and how to act effectively. And I know it's a little bit overwhelming right now, but I'll run you through each of the key decision points to show how you can implement this in practice. So the very first question to ask is whether misinformation is expected or is already out there. And so sometimes we can identify that misinformation might not already be spreading, or a particular type of misinformation or narrative is not already spreading, but it's likely to arise in the future. And as an example, it could be that we see certain piece of misinformation spreading in another country, and we can guess that it might be coming to our jurisdiction shortly, perhaps because of the stage we are in an election cycle. And when misinformation is not yet already out there, the best approach is pre-bunking. So pre-bunking is best understood with an analogy with inoculation. Like receiving a vaccine in your arm, pre-bunking exposes people to small doses of misinformation to build resistance to future exposures. So an effective pre-bunk has 2 key elements. The first is a motivational warning. This alerts people to the bad faith actors, and it's really the why of misinformation. What's in it for them? So consider this example. Political actors shift blame for social issues onto refugees and migrants because spreading fear is an easy win for political gain. The reason this works is that no one likes to be manipulated. So calling out the why encourages skepticism and critical thinking towards future misinformation. The second part of an effective pre-bunk is the preemptive refutation. This explains the how of why misinformation is false. And there's two ways to do this. The first is a technique-based approach, which highlights the persuasive tactics that misinformation spreaders use, such as emotional manipulation, selective framing, or cherry-picking of data. For instance, a straw man argument might say, advocates for refugee rights want open borders and unlimited migration. And so this clearly misrepresents the position of most advocacy groups so that they're easier to attack. And the benefits of kind of focusing on this sort of technique-based approach, basically the logical fallacies that are being relied on, is that they generalize across different areas of misinformation. So explaining how specific tactics are used to manipulate public opinion on one topic, such as refugees, helps people spot and resist the same tactics used elsewhere in the future, say around climate misinformation. The second approach to the preemptive refutation is issue-based. So this educates audiences to have a deeper understanding of a specific issue. The more contextual information that people have around an issue, the more resistant they are to false information because the falsities don't fit into their schema. While they are effective issues-based refutations, don't generalize to misinformation about other topics. And so what the latest research shows is that the best pre-bunking strategies combine elements of a motivational warning, a technique-based refutation, and an issues-based refutation. And to see examples of what this looks like in practice, we have examples of worked out pre-bunking examples that are included in the report. So going back now to our decision tree, what if we have assessed the evidence and decided that misinformation is already out there? How do we decide whether to act or not? So if misinformation is already circulating, you need to ask the 3 Ps. Is it prominent in that it's gaining traction or visibility? Is it persuasive in that it has the potential to change beliefs or behavior? And is it proximate in that it's being shared by sources close to your audience? Or in other words, is it spreading in the here and now? If misinformation is not prominent, persuasive, and proximate, then ignore it and reframe the agenda. And there are a few reasons for doing this. The first is that you don't want to unnecessarily risk amplifying the falsehoods by shining a spotlight on them. And you don't want to let bad faith actors control the narratives. So this strategy is all about regaining control over the public narrative. So reframing the agenda is about promoting accurate, values-driven narratives. Similar to the issues-based refutation tactic I talked about before, this tactic shapes society's values and knowledge around the issue and makes us more resilient to misinformation about refugees and migrants in the future. So what if misinformation is gaining traction? In other words, what if it is, what if you've assessed the 3 Ps and it is prominent, persuasive, and proximate? Then you can debunk it. And maybe I'll hold off for that for a second. So I'll talk a little bit about, before jumping into a worked up example, I'll talk a little bit about how to debunk effectively. Debunking can be tricky because we risk amplifying false claims and reinforcing them in people's minds if we talk about them. But so the more recent evidence shows that these backfire effects aren't quite as big as we previously thought. And so we reviewed the research and sort of identified the best structure for setting out an effective debunk, which is what we colloquially refer to as the fact sandwich, or the fact, myth, fallacy, fact approach. And so I'll sort of demonstrate this now with a debunking example in relation to narratives around the link between migration and community safety. So we want to start with the truth. And so here we say, migrants contribute positively to the safety and vitality of our communities. Studies show that areas with large immigration populations often experience lower crime rates compared to areas with fewer immigrants. We then want to warn about the misinformation, but doing it as briefly as possible and diluting the misinformation to take the heat out of it. So here we say some claim that migration makes our communities less safe. So we then want to explain the flaw in the misinformation, or the fallacy that is at the heart of the misinformation. So this is basically the manipulation tactic that is being used, or where evidence is incorrect. So there are frameworks you can refer to doing this. And so in the report, we append what's known as the FLIC framework, which is this basically huge map of all the different types of logical fallacies, which was developed in the context of climate misinformation. But we've also been working and experimenting with AI and ChatGPT, which can actually be very helpful in helping you identify the logical fallacies and arguments. So in our example here, we say research consistently shows that migrants are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. It's important to avoid generalizations based on isolated incidents. And then finally, you want to again end with the fact and reinforce the correct information. So here we say, beyond safety, migrants bring numerous benefits to their host communities. They start businesses, fill essential jobs, and enrich our cultural fabric. By embracing diversity, we strengthen our society as a whole. So this fact sandwich structure makes corrections clear, credible, and effective. And the reason you start and end with the fact is because of the primacy and recency effects. People are most likely to remember the first and last thing that they hear. So those first and last sentences really matter. But it's also important to acknowledge that facts alone are often not persuasive. And this is where things get a bit trickier. And so emotions and values play a big part in public persuasion. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when I'm talking about engagement strategies. But I think often, and we face this issue ourselves when we were developing some of the templates. So I have to say there's 4 or 5 more worked up examples included as an appendix to the report. But there's often multiple correct facts to choose from when doing a debunk. But it's also really important how you frame those facts as well. And there's a lot of research that shows values-based messaging or using narrative in your messaging are very important. And I think, at least for now, for me, I think that's more of an art than a science in terms of how you embed the correct facts in the correct values-based messaging, and also noting that it really depends on your audience, and different audiences respond to different types of messaging. So trying to be as tailored as possible when creating the values-based framing around your correct facts is very important. So these misinformation interventions only work if people actually see and engage with them. And I think, unfortunately, it's the case that the people that are most vulnerable to misinformation are the ones that are probably most likely to not engage with the interventions that we create for them to engage with. So it's essential to consider engagement in all communications against misinformation. And this, in the concluding part of the report, we set out 7 behavioral strategies you can use to increase the reach and impact. So the first is around achieving as much volume as possible. So we need to use consistency, repetition, and coordination. The more people see a message, the more credible and trustworthy it is. And so ideally, we can build sort of collaborations or cross-sector collaborations where we align the messaging strategies so that allied actors are all reinforcing the same message in your communications, which is exactly the same tactic that we're seeing being used very effectively by people who are pushing misinformation. The second strategy is around using targeted channels, which basically means meeting your audience where they are, and thinking, I guess, more broadly when it comes to the format of interventions, which shouldn't not just rely on text, like my example that I gave you did earlier, but also through engaging video and visual content. And it's also very important to use familiar and relatable messengers. So as we discussed again in the principles around how misinformation spreads, people tend to trust messengers that they identify with. So what's important is to align the messenger with who your audience trusts. The next principle is around leveraging social norms. People don't act in isolation. We all tend to care deeply about what other people in our social group thinks. So, in the Australian context, we've had recent polling data that shows that the majority of people believe that immigration has a positive impact on Australia. So, in our comms, we've really been emphasising this to show that, reinforcing this in our messaging around countering misinformation. The next principle, and one that I've already touched on already, is the importance of appealing to values and emotions. So sometimes facts, or unfortunately, facts often aren't enough alone. So we need to connect with what matters to people. And because people prioritize different values, tailoring messages to appeal to the distinct values of your target audience is very important. And we have a little bit more detail in the report about effective values-based messaging strategies. Another strategy is around using humor to attract attention wherever possible. This can be very difficult, and I have to say, not something we've mastered ourselves at the Kaldor Centre yet, but where you can do it effectively, it can be a way of engaging or getting people to engage with information they might not otherwise engage with. And finally, it's very important to act as quickly as possible. So misinformation spreads rapidly because it's often more novel, emotionally charged, and persuasive than the truth. The more time people see the misinformation, the bigger the harm. So the earlier that we can act, the better. Just before I wrap up, one of the key takeaways from the report is that for best results, campaigns should be coordinated between an ecosystem of allied actors. And that's part of the reason why I was so pleased to have the opportunity to present to you today. I think increasingly, I think it's important that these networks are not just focusing in one jurisdiction, but are transnational, given the transnational nature of misinformation and the fact that we're often seeing similar misinformation arise in different jurisdictions. And I think developing these transnational networks or communities of practice around how we engage and respond to misinformation is really important. So I'm really keen to hear from the audience about, I guess, your experiences dealing with misinformation or reactions to the report or any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Just as a point of information, when is the report published?
Oh, it's out, and I think Valentina's put a link to the report in the chat.
Okay, great, and we'll share it via our channels as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I just might add very quickly as well that there's some on the link that's been sent. There's a bunch of supporting information as well, including blank pre-bunking and debunking templates, but also a sort of 2-minute. Very accessible video that provides a sort of overview for the framework and how to put it in action. And I guess any assistance in spreading the word and sharing that video in particular would be very appreciated.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So what I'd like to do now is, well, we have around half an hour or so for questions and discussion. So I was going to open up in the room initially, may take some questions, and then people online, you're very welcome if you want to join a discussion, but I think if you could put your questions into the chat function, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So who'd like to start? So I see Martin and Lenka and but if you could introduce yourselves as well, that would be great. Thank you. And use the microphones then.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Martin Roos. I'm based at the MPC at the EUI. So thank you very much. This was really very interesting presentation, also very important work. I suppose I have one general question which occurred to me as I listened to you, which is, I mean, what's your approach to what is a fact? And two things occur to me. So one, I think there's a lot of information out there which is not factually incorrect, but you could argue misleading. So for example, I could say, I don't know, somebody has done X, I mean, facts about a whole group. So I could say immigration increases crime, which might be true because there's more people in the country and crime goes up because some immigrants commit crimes. That's not surprising, but the crime rate goes down. So if somebody says immigration increases crime, it could be correct, but it's incomplete or maybe misleading. So I'm just wondering how you respond to that in terms of fact and debunking, because you're not, challenging kind of completely misinformed point. And the second one is more about values. So I would say the last fact you had there, I would disagree that all of this is factual. I mean, you'd say that you had like immigration brings benefits, yes. I mean, I agree with it, but then at the end you had it culturally enriches society. I mean, I would agree with that, but I think that's a very value-laden statement, which somebody else might, with the different values, might not agree with that, but not, so it's not a fact. And I'm just wondering, I think it's a bit dangerous sometimes to kind of tell people they got the facts wrong when in fact what you're criticizing is their values. If you see what I mean. So I'm just wondering, how do you decide what is it, how do you define facts and what to go after?
So we maybe take 3 questions to start with then. So Lenka, you're next. If you introduce yourself as well.
Yes, Lenka Drajanova, MPC. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And coming from public opinion research, where we kind of know that a lot of people form their attitudes pretty early, as also attitudes to migration, and then it's quite hard to change any attitudes. What matters is, for example, you can work up a little bit, not to go to the extreme, but it's hard to change anyone's mind. So I have several questions, but I will stick to one now. When you talk, because Martin touched upon a little bit the values problem, which I agree with, because maybe emphasizing multiculturalism, you are preaching to the converted, right? And the people you actually want to engage with, that's not a value that they aspire to. But aside that, you mentioned the importance of the messenger, which I could agree with. But when you say we should use messengers people trust, then again, for example, I give, let's say the European Commission would be a messenger I would trust, but I'm not your audience. The ones you want to convince, they would trust Donald Trump. Do you use Donald Trump as the messenger? So how do you choose the proper messenger for the objective you have in this sense? So this would be one of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And then third question, please, if you could introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Yes, hello, I'm Julia. I'm a new Max Weber Fellow here. And my question is about conspiracy theories. I was thinking that there's probably a spectrum from misinformation to full conspiracy theories, such as the Great Replacement. And I think they have, in a way, similar techniques as you suggested, namely say why back and try to find a reason why people try to give this information to you. So I wondered, is there a way that you can actually engage with conspiracy theories with your methods?
So that's 3 relatively easy questions to start with, Anna, just to warm up. So over to you.
Thank you. Martin, that's a really good question. And I think something that we have really grappled with in terms of trying to put this into action in the Australian context. And, I think where the kind of framework works best is when there's something that's like patently untrue. Yeah, and I think it's very clear, and and I think it's quite effective in implementing it in that context. And so, I mean, this example is, I had to come up with this one because I did something for an international audience, because all our examples are very Australian focused. So so the Australian one's a little bit more kind of, so this is purely as an example. I don't want you going out using any of these examples. But like, for example, like one of the most kind of persuasive sort of narrative in the lead up to our recent election in Australia was around the link between migration and house prices. And basically that was what we heard from, constantly from everyone, migrants are pushing up houses. And, it's not misinformation. It's very nuanced. It's overstating the problem. It's overstating the causes. And so you see like our very attempt for this like very nuanced kind of debunk, and that's one that doesn't have much values-based messaging in there. But it makes it really difficult because the misinformation, people pushing misinformation present everything as black and white. And it's very difficult to push back and cut through with like detailed, nuanced argument. There it's like, it's all about the sort of tax incentives for investors and lack of housing supply. It's much easier to believe the story that no, it's just migration is the reason that housing prices are going up. And if we stop migration, then I'll be able to buy a house. And yeah, I think the issue you pose is this sort of gray area. And maybe even the language of debunking is not the correct language to be using there. And I think we're kind of verging into the area of kind of values-based messaging rather than like an actual debunk where you're showing that the evidence it's completely untrue. I mean, something like, the immigrants are eating the cats, that is maybe something that this framework is much better suited to dealing with because, something that actually has a strong evidence base. And, there will be conflicting evidence often as well. And so, and again, that's why we kind of lean to really blur the line sometimes between values-based framing and messaging. It really, yeah, I think I do share your view though that maybe the language, the framing of debunk is not accurate when you're dealing with issues that don't have a clear black and white answer or it's conflicting evidence. On the messages that people trust, I have to say this is one we've probably got the most pushback on in the report, and particularly when we talk with sort of refugee advocacy groups, and there's I think a very I guess a noble and welcome trend to foregrounding views of people with lived experience as the related, like the messengers to advocate for more sort of lawful and sustainable policy responses. But I think we need to balance that, and I think the people that you wouldn't usually expect to hear from on an issue that support your view are the ones that are often the most persuasive in changing the opinion of the people that you want to change. And so we can't just focus on sort of preaching to the choir. So finding those messengers, in Australia is the example of the tradie or like the builder who comes out and says, we need more immigrants because we have a skills shortage. We don't have enough people to build houses. And that's not really the type of demographic you'd usually think that would be supporting immigration, but kind of those sorts of campaigns are the ones that tend to have the most cut through. And and there's being persuasive is also not the only reason to take into account when choosing a messenger. There are other valuable considerations to take into account. For example, foregrounding lived experience. So I don't think we're saying you have to go with the unexpected always, but I think it's important for us to take a broader view in terms of who we get to be advocates in this space. And maybe I'll give you one more example. One of the most effective campaigns we had in Australia, we get very few wins in the refugee migration space. The one was sort of ending the detention of children on Nauru and bringing all the children that were held there on offshore processing to Australia. And there it was really like when the doctors and the peak medical bodies came out and started saying this is wrong. When there was refugee advocates saying it, no one was listening. And when we managed to get the doctors and also the faith-based actors, the church and others coming out, that's when the needle shifted. So It doesn't have to be a trader, it can also be other professionals as well. The question on conspiracy theories is a great one also. I think to the extent that the conspiracy theories include misinformation, which they almost always do, I think that the framework would be effective in applying in that context as well.
So we've got a couple of questions in the room, but there's also some questions on. Oh, sorry, we've got a couple of questions in the room, and some online. So I was going to do take a couple online, a couple in the room, if that's okay. So the first one is from Amir, and it's about social media. And this is people can probably see it in the chat box, but I'll read it. Social media is an ocean of information that is hard to trace. How can we use tools such as AI or other things to identify online misinformation? That's from Amir. And then from Gerasimos, who's actually a fellow here at EUI, but not with us in person today. So he was wondering how your work might apply in contexts where it's not only individuals or media circulating myths, but states themselves producing what he would call fictions of scale. For instance, Jordan claims to host 1.3 million Syrian refugees, while UNHCR records about 670,000. Egypt advances a claim of 10 to 11 million guests, conflating migrants, refugees, and dual nationals. These figures are not fabricated in the sense of being wholly false, but they're politically expansive and difficult to verify. So how do we counter or at least engage with these kinds of state-produced narratives of migration which carry official authority and circulate internationally? So those from Amir and Gerasimos. And then in the room, we have a question over here, please.
Hi, I'm Maciej Grześkowiak. I'm a new fellow, Max Weber Fellow at the Law Department. Thank you for the presentation, for the report. I found it personally very, very interesting and needed, to be honest. My question concerns platform. I believe there are quite limited things that us academics can do to reach a wider audience. I mean, we can write social media posts, opinion pieces, or whatever, but we'll never reach audience as wide as some politicians or some popular podcasters or YouTube streamers or whatever. So my question concerns what would you recommend doing in that regard? And in particular, should we engage with channels that are known to spread misinformation? You mentioned that you recommend reaching audience where they are. So I would assume that you would recommend that, but then there are channels that I would personally have my doubts. I had this situation a few months ago. I worked for the Polish Ombudsman and I got invited to speak about the Migration Pact at a YouTube channel that is very popular, is very right-wing and very known to spread misinformation. And the decision at the time was not to go. And I was quite happy at the time, but I've been wondering ever since whether that was a mistake or not. And yeah, I'm wondering about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorenzo?
Hi, thanks a lot. Excellent presentation. My name is Lorenzo Piccoli. I'm a part-time assistant professor at the Migration Policy Center and at the School of Transnational Governance at the UI. And I'm going to make your job easier because my question was just been asked, actually. I feel that sometimes we feel a bit like David against Goliath. And a lot of people who listen to misinformation and disinformation, they listen to maybe the Joe Rogan podcast, they go on Truth Social. And I also wonder whether it's our job to engage with that. And a lot of the tactics that you present in the report, actually, I don't have those skills. And just to give a very concrete example, these days there is a very heated debate about asylum seekers in the UK. And my feed, because I'm also in an echo chamber, is inundated with contents from, I guess we can call her an influencer, Zoe Gardner, who goes a lot on the BBC. And it just, I don't see that as my job. And also linking back to the question by Martin earlier, I feel that my task as a researcher, as an academic, is to bring nuance to debate. And I feel a bit, my concern is that this pushes us also to oversimplify messages. And I see a big dilemma for us in there. But thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think we've got questions stacking up. So if we can These are quite complex issues, but we can maybe try and be relatively brief and get everybody's questions taken.
No, thank you, Sam. These are excellent questions. So firstly to Amir about kind of identifying misinformation using AI. I mean, I think that's kind of the I guess some of the fantasy that some of the social media platforms are selling us, and Twitter has a Grok which you can use to live fact check anything that any tweet that comes up with the sort of mixed success. But I don't think that is really I guess the most pressing issue at hand. I think it's that I think we just accept the fact that the internet and social media is just flooded with misinformation. I think what is the pressing task at hand is to identify which of those things is meets one of those three P's. So it's prominent, proximate, and persuasive. And I think if you need the aid of AI to identify whether something is misinformation, great. But I think often you'll be able to tell straight up, particularly as an academic expert on a topic, whether misinformation is false or not. But I think a few of these questions, and there's a bit of a tangent. I think the more pressing thing, and the more pressing thing in the long term, is around the regulation of online environments. And it's something that I didn't touch on in my remarks. I think, maybe a bit more framing. This was really, the motivation for this was around initiating this work was around the recent Australian election, and we wanted something about what we and others in the sector in Australia can do right now in the here and now to try and push back against misinformation. But really, much more effective in the longer term is going to be effective regulation of online platforms. I know it's a very difficult and complex topic, and it's not one that I have deep expertise on. But finding some sort of way to hold platforms accountable for the accuracy of the content that is spread there would be the most effective way to address this, acknowledging all the issues that come with that. And I think goes back to Martin's question at the beginning: is what is the truth and what is fact and what is not fact. The other tactic, the other strategy, long-term strategy, is around kind of building media literacy. And I think being able to do that would be kind of equally, maybe I think it's probably the most promising long-term strategy. And in that regard, we're really pleased that the Australian government added the framework in our report to the high school national curriculum for high school students. But that's it's one very small part, but kind of building a public that is has the media literacy and kind of understands how to spot misinformation and also how to respond to it. It would be very effective. So that's a very roundabout way of answering your question, Amir. But I think going back to the AI point, the one thing that we did experiment with is around kind of the identifying the logical fallacies in arguments. So it actually proved to be quite effective in doing that. On the question about states producing misinformation, I think this was maybe the unstated purpose of the report, really, because we were most concerned about misinformation that was being put forward by certain politicians in Australia. So I think definitely the framework is designed to apply both to state actors and non-state actors. On the question about the platform and audience, that's a really, really good one and a tricky one, and one that we've grappled with ourselves. And I think it became quite clear to me early on that, as the Kaldor Centre, we were not the ones that were going to be implementing this in practice. And really, this was a resource to equip others who do have that. And it answers your question as well about, finding those allies in the sector who do have the platform to be able to implement this in practice. So by way of example, we've been trying to engage journalists that work on immigration and migration issues in Australia to sort of introduce them to the report, and also the way they structure their stories to respond to misinformation, to incorporate this. We've also been working with actually politicians as well. And so they're the ones that have the biggest platform, in particular politicians that are on the side of politics that wouldn't usually align with our thinking. So the politicians from the right, and we've had some success where there are people that fit that bill that are passionate about refugee and migrant issues, and kind of taking this to them and saying, no, you would be the perfect spokesperson for this because you can reach that audience, because you are that relatable messenger, going back to our earlier discussion. I think that question on specific platforms is a very tricky one. I think you probably made the right decision about not going on it, because I don't think you are the right messenger on that platform to get a good response. And ideally, you would find someone who would be relatable on that platform to be the spokesperson for these issues there, but it's probably not you. And the final words, that question about oversimplification again is one. I mean, this is one, and it goes, I guess, similar to Martin's point initially. Again, something that we've grappled with a lot, and again, as part of that decision that we made, that we're not necessarily the best spokesperson as academics to be pushing this, and so really working with advocacy organizations or other people that are already out there doing public messaging around this. I mean, I think probably a shared thing in other jurisdictions as well, but I think in Australia, reflecting on maybe the past 15 years where I've been involved in this space, things have been going backwards. We haven't, there's a lot of people out there advocating on this issue. We haven't been able to cut through. So trying to equip those existing actors to engage more effectively, I think, is one way we can sort of contribute as academics in this space.
Thanks. So we take a mix of some online. And we've got some questions in the room. So I'll just one's online first. The first one is, how can we reframe narratives that start from denial, such as migration is not a crime, since they risk reinforcing the very misconceptions we aim to debunk? That question was from Odilia. Then Elisabetta Kowalczuk asks how we deal with the wave of misinformation which is expected, whereas when there is already some out there. For example, a certain attitude to a specific group is already there, but this attitude is tried to be changed even more. And then a third one from Natalia Saeed from the Australian Red Cross. I wonder if this can be presented for training to social media policymakers, mainstream media providers, to combat misinformation and that's spread around migrants and refugees, especially given the current March for Australia rallies. So we'll take those. I'd put those three into the mix. And then Isabella, can you introduce yourself as well?
My name is Isabella Grabowska. I'm new Brudel Fellow in Social and Political Sciences Department here at EUI. Thank you very much, Daniel, for the presentation. I missed a little bit overarching theoretical approach to that. And I was wondering if can you consider the concept or theory of effective publics, which is a very nice theory which shows how people show emotions, values, and so on. And I go into digital networks and then creating the information bubbles, yes? So, but the emotions, as you said, are the main drivers. So I missed a little bit this, but maybe it's in the book. So is it? That's the first question. The second question, have you analyzed only the content of misinformation or you're as well as sender of misinformation? Because we analyzed Twitter 1 year data from Twitter from first year of war in Ukraine. And we needed to distinguish bots and humans because the patterns of misinformation and toxicity is totally different among humans and bots. And my question is, have you distinguished that? And if so, how misinformation should be debunked with humans and with bots, if so? Thank you very much, and thank you for appealing presentation.
A response? Yeah. Thank you again. A really excellent round of questions. I think starting with the first one around, I guess that that example you gave about, migration is not a crime. I think it goes not so much to the kind of narrative that you're pushing yourself, but the way that you frame it. And this is something we grapple with a lot when we were doing our own examples, is that you don't want your opening line to actually be reinforcing the negative or the misinformation, because what that does, it reinforces that misinformation. And so that's why when the narrative, that sort of the fact sandwich approach that we have, which is starting with the truth and then only giving a kind of very watered down version of the misinformation in the middle is very important. And I would have, even the wording about I chose for the example I gave, I didn't want to say, the link between migration and crime, because saying that already reinforces the misinformation. And so we have to be very careful about how we frame the narratives when we want to engage in this context. The question, I mean, that's a very nuanced question about the line between sort of when we pre-bunk and when we debunk. When we're trying to decide whether something is in fact already out there, or how different the I guess the new thing that we're worried about is from existing misinformation. And I don't have a hard and fast answer to that. And I think maybe I'll default to the 3 Ps. And if the 3 Ps aren't met, don't debunk. If you think you need to engage, use the pre-bunk method. And the question on training is, we are very happy to present to anyone who's interested in hearing from us. we've had a really great reception in the Australian context from a whole bunch of actors that I guess we wouldn't usually engage with, local government in particular, both sort of elected local government as well as support staff at local councils, who have been actually one of the great messages we've had in terms of engaging in this space. Media providers have been a little bit more tricky for us to get audience with. So if you have any leads in that regard, we'd be very delighted to follow them up. And on the question about the theoretical framework, so this is, to be clear, it's not a book. It's very much just a practical toolkit. And I have to say, it's also not particularly original or novel in terms of the research here. So it's really I guess a review of this existing literature and sort of pulling out a really practical, synthesized approach to dealing with the issue, which we sort of hadn't seen out there, because before we embarked on this project, I was trying to find something like this for us to be able to use in our own work. But I think the suggestions that you gave about, I think if we build on this work, it would be really interesting to pursue various theoretical frameworks to include. The question on the type or profile of the sender is a really interesting one, and honestly one that I had not turned my mind to. But this distinction between whether it's a bot or whether it's human-based misinformation, I don't think would make a material difference in terms of on this very narrow question of how we respond, because we're not actually responding to the sender, but we're responding to how that information may be processed by the receiver. And so I know I welcome your thoughts. I think it's something I had to reflect on further, because honestly, I hadn't turned my mind to it. But my initial reaction that the response would be the same.
Thanks, and very grateful for all the people from all over the world who've joined this seminar. So we've got some questions online. I think they're quite interesting and very relevant. So Karolina Żywińska, I hope I pronounced that correctly, apologies if I didn't, from Save the Children. So in the context of this framework, how do you see the role of storytelling, for example, sharing experiences, particularly individuals that might both challenge misinforming narratives and resonate emotionally with audiences? Then Emmanuel Laloum is referring to an easy to share short training module will be very helpful to spread awareness in our networks. I'm not sure which organisation Emmanuel is from, but perhaps you can address this issue of the kind of a deck or video or whatever, and you may already have these things to spread awareness, and something you can consider doing. There's a reference from Audrey Hitchcock from ICM with a link to some resources that can be useful for media professionals. So those are, and if we've got a final chance, anybody in the room would like to contribute to the discussion? If not, then very happy to hand back to Daniel for kind of wrapping up with these final questions. Thanks.
No, thank you so much for these questions. I think the storytelling one is one that comes up often because I think there is, I guess, a lot of organizations working in this space are very committed to storytelling as an effective message strategy. And I think there's a lot of research to back that up. And I think it's possible to do that in within the framework in terms of how we frame the debunk, also the messages that we use. But again, that tension between what your audience is and whether first-person storytelling is the most, with people with affected individuals, is the most effective for that particular audience. I think it's very, very effective for some audiences and not so effective for others. And in relation to the question on training modules, we have a variety of resources available on the link that was shared there that may assist in that regard. There are various videos of various lengths depending on the audience and your needs. So at the most basic and simple, there's a sort of 2-minute, very accessible video that runs you through the decision tree and how to use it. And then we also have a 20-minute speed briefing that goes through the framework in more detail. But I'd be very interested to hear from you if you think something more tailored would be useful for what you had in mind. So please feel free to get in touch over email. And thank you all so much again. Those were really, really stimulating questions and discussion. And thank you so much, Andrew, again, for hosting me.
Oh, thank you. So thanks to Daniel. Thanks also. I know we've got a very big and very active, interactive online participation. Thanks for those who joined us online as well. So it's great that I've noticed people from all over the world who joined. So, and we'd encourage you, we've put a link to the report and we're very happy to share it through NPC channels. And we're quite active in thinking about these issues ourselves and training and various activities. So we've probably got a lot to talk about as well. So thanks very much, Daniel. And have a nice morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are.